Good evening, everyone. If you've used the internet any decent amount as of late, you probably have heard about net neutrality. And if you do not know what that is, net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers should treat all internet content equally, regardless of the user, the content, the website, or the platform. Recently, the Federal Communications Commission of the United States has moved to repeal net neutrality. And I propose that repealing net neutrality will negatively impact the experiences of internet users in the United States. And I'm going to address three main points. Firstly, repealing net neutrality will cause internet users to pay more for the same services that they receive today. Afterwards, I'll discuss how without net neutrality, internet users will be restricted from accessing content that ISPs deem as undesirable. And thirdly, I'll be discussing how internet users will be restricted from uploading content that is deemed undesirable by ISPs. My first point is that internet users will have to pay more for the same services that today they receive for free. Without net neutrality, internet service providers are free to use otherwise restricted practices such as internet fast lanes and internet bundles or packages, which essentially force users to pay more for either faster internet speeds or to access additional websites and applications. And we have some idea as how this may work if we look at Portugal. As a Business Insider article mentions, while Portugal does have to abide by the net neutrality regulations of the European Union, their primary internet service provider, MEO, does offer data upgrades and bundles that allow for faster internet speeds for certain applications. If you, say, are a heavy user of messaging applications, you can pay an additional €5 on top of your normal fees to have faster speeds and more data for those applications. If you also want those faster speeds for video streaming, that's an additional €5 on top of that, and it just builds from there. Now, some may argue that United States companies would never use these practices, but reporters at The Verge have asked United States companies, ISPs, such as AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast, and they have given the public no assurance that they would not use these practices if net neutrality was not in place. And Comcast has even gone so far as to remove statements from their website saying that they do not support internet fast lanes and paid prioritization. Additionally, ISPs can look to online services and companies and charge them for use of ISP infrastructure. While larger companies might be able to handle this additional payment, smaller companies might have to shoulder the burden to their users, forcing them to pay for the access that they would normally have. And this is assuming that they are even able to access the content in the first place, which leads to my second point, that ISPs would be able to restrict user access to content that they deem undesirable. Without net neutrality, first and foremost, broadband discrimination regulations cease to be, and as CNET discusses, without net neutrality, ISPs are free to favor certain websites that, especially those that pay for prioritization, essentially giving them faster speeds and giving websites that do not pay or have content that is potentially divisive, giving them slower speeds and less access. As the consumerist details, probably perhaps the most well-known example of this involves Netflix and Comcast, who in 2014 had a disagreement over how Comcast was handling Netflix's broadband. Comcast was found to be bottlenecking Netflix's broadband, which severely slowed the download speeds of users of Netflix and Comcast. While Netflix was able to come to an agreement with Comcast on this issue, smaller companies might not be able to do so and will be forced to either look to their their users for additional payment, or be forced to stick with slower speeds and less access. And that is assuming that the content is even allowed on the internet in the first place, which leads to my third point, that without net neutrality, internet users will be restricted in the content that they can upload if ISPs deem them as undesirable. Once again, we can look to Comcast, the second largest ISP in the United States, who has had as our primary example of ISPs blocking the uploading of content. Back in 2007, Comcast was found to be severely restricting the access of users of websites such as BitTorrent and other file sharing networks, which, while they do have a reputation of having copyrighted material illegally shared, are also often used to share completely legal material. Now, if you were to wish to get around these restrictions or these paywalls by switching to a different ISP, you would probably be out of luck, as the majority of households have only the choice of 1 to 2 different ISPs on average, making it near impossible to switch to a different ISP without moving to a different area. With that, we can see that without net neutrality, internet users will have to pay more for the same services that they receive today. They'll be restricted from accessing content, and they'll be restricted from uploading content so long as ISPs deem them as undesirable. Hopefully you can now see that without net neutrality, internet experiences will be severely negatively impacted. Thank you.
All right, Ian, the proposition's clear. The structural stuff at the beginning is all fine. The secondary claims are labeled as declarative sentences, so that's all solid. Like I said, when you get to the body of the speech, you're doing a good job signposting those points as well. I think you explained the concept pretty well. I like the definition that you had in the introduction of what net neutrality is supposed to accomplish and be, so that makes it a little bit easier to comprehend some of the argument. The first point, where you're talking about, you might have to pay more for services. It does seem to be that there are a lot of assumptions going on here, and we've got some hypotheticals that we're dealing with. I think when you get to the second and the third points, you do have a couple of examples here. And that helps a little bit, but it really feels sort of speculative at this point. And that doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons to speculate in that direction, but I think you need to build a little bit stronger argument on that. These seems to be conclusions and accepted premises without much reason to believe that. As an example, just thinking off the top of my head, almost all technology, regardless of what it starts off with, tends to get cheaper as time goes by, and the idea that we're going to go in the reverse direction for internet access seems to be a little bit counterintuitive. So I think you need to have an explanation about why that would be the likely outcome, not just kind of assuming it. The second and the third points, I thought, on restricting access, I thought you had a clearer explanation on some of these things than I've heard in other speeches on this subject. It's not so much as it is a censorship as it is the notion that they're choosing what organizations or businesses to support or allow based on what kind of business they can get from them, and it's all a money thing. The bottlenecking example that you mentioned about Comcast and Netflix on that second point, one of the questions that pops into my head is just thinking about it is, if Netflix is using up all the bandwidth, doesn't that have a consequence to other people? And is the fast lane sort of thing solution to that, or is it better that everybody has the same access? And I think that's where there's some controversy on this particular point, and there should be some explanation about why we have to choose between those two things. The third point, you do need to have some data talking about the lack of options that consumers have. I mean, you mentioned that there are usually only one or two ISP choices available, and I don't doubt that that's probably true, but I think you ought to have a source citation on it. A little overtime, so you want to be careful about that. I thought you did a pretty good job speaking to us. Yeah, I know you had to duck to your notes a couple of times, but that wasn't a big deal. I mean, I didn't expect people to memorize everything that they were talking about. I just expected you to understand what your argument was, and I thought you did a good job doing that. All right, thank you.